Welcome to the Missing Middle podcast. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
Recently, we've seen some cities and municipalities voting on whether to draft bylaws on multiplexes. Specifically, it's about whether to draft bylaws that allow 4 units on any lot. And we've seen this in Mississauga. We saw this in Kitchener, in Guelph. And Mississauga said no, while Guelph and Kitchener said yes. So I wanted to talk to you, Mike, about that. First of all, why do you think it didn't pass in Mississauga, but it did in those other 2 places?
Yeah, this is a bit of an issue, and Mississauga has always had a reputation for being somewhat NIMBY-ish, and not wanting too much density in suburban neighborhoods, sort of a tall and sprawl approach, and they've lived up to that moniker that as part of the federal housing accelerator that the housing minister Fraser has put a number of conditions on municipalities that want to access that money. And one of the conditions they've been putting on this is the ability to build 4 units as of right in any lot.
When you say as of right, it's like, it means that like no one can say no?
Well, basically, how it works right now in most cities is that if it's a R1 zoning, so that's the basic kind of zoning that you have for a suburban home. If you want to build a single detached home, you can, and nobody can sort of essentially stop you as long as you meet the other requirements of setbacks and parking minimums and that kind of thing. Whereas if you want to build a home with 3 separate units or 4 separate units, you have to go get permission from the city, and there's a whole process, and your neighbors get to weigh in and complain about it. So the change here is that you could then do that as of right, which makes a lot of sense to me. I live in an existing neighborhood in Ottawa. And, the status quo is like, I could tear down my home tomorrow, my 100-year-old home tomorrow, and build a McMansion, and nobody could really stop me. But if I wanted to tear down the home and build, 4 smaller units to help address Ottawa's housing crisis, I would go through this whole process. So that's the idea here, that you'd be able to do these things as of right, the same way you could with a single detached home.
I know that the provincial government in Ontario put in a rule allowing triplexes across the board, all around the province. But this, from my understanding, these proposals that they're making is not just adding 1 more, but also in Toronto, at least, it expanded some of the rules. So I know that there was a rule in the provincial plan that said you can build triplexes, but you can't add square footage to the home. So your 100-year-old home, as you said, you could build a much bigger McMansion, but if you wanted it to be a duplex, you would have to do it in the current square footage of your home. You can't add another floor. Is that still on the table right now in these new plans?
Yeah, so for the new ones, know that the federal government isn't requiring that as part of the housing accelerator. It's more just the building 4 units as of right. So there is some sort of wiggle room for municipalities to define what that means. And
are they doing that?
That's well, we haven't actually seen that yet. That basically cities have kind of agreed to this thing, but the actual official plans and the actual zoning bylaws haven't actually changed yet. So the devil is in the details, but what they're basically doing is kind of agreeing in principle and saying, okay, yes, we will do this, and we are happy to accept your money. And for the most part, in most cities, that this has been going through as part of the housing accelerator, not just passing, but passing unopposed, where cities are saying, okay, yeah, we'll do this, and it's passing 12-0 or whatever their council size is. Mississauga was interesting that this ended up being a 5-5 vote on council. And the reason why it's an even number and not an odd number like it usually is that the mayor has essentially recused herself from this process as she runs for provincial liberal leader. So, there's a whole kind of subtext here of, a missing sort of politician. So this is interesting and a little unexpected to me that again, although Mississauga has traditionally had this kind of reputation, I didn't expect it to play out the way it did.
And when you say that it's tall and sprawl there, I guess that's like you see the tall buildings all concentrated in those one or a few areas in a lot of these places, and then just sprawl everywhere else, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there are a lot of high rises in Mississauga, but we have basically what we call the missing middle. That there's nothing sort of in between, right? So you get these 30 and 40 story apartment buildings that could be condos, it could be rentals, and then kind of a sea of single detached homes, and you have these kind of missing other housing types, whether they be row housing or triplexes or things like that. I mean, they exist obviously, but not in huge proportions relative to other communities. So yeah, it's just been the history of design in Mississauga over the last 30 to 40 years, where you get these two housing types and not a lot in between.
I know that there was a time recently that you had released some information about how Mississauga had approved. I think it was they hadn't approved any new developments. What happened there?
Yeah, it was pretty low. So one of the things that we've been doing is tracking the provincial targets. So the province has set housing starts or housing completion targets, and they're actually not clear in their own mind what they've set. Are they measuring starts or completions? But they've set these targets, and we've been tracking progress towards these targets. And Mississauga is near the bottom. That they've been around 20 or 25% of the rate that they need to be. And yeah, I think there was a month a few months ago where they had completed two houses and approved one or something like ridiculous like that, where it should be closer to a few hundred or 1,000. Which did end up generating headlines, which I didn't really mean to do. I just put this out there, and some journalists picked up on it. Um, but yeah, it has been a challenge. In Mississauga's defense, that they'll say, well, look, we don't build homes, we don't even start homes, we just create the conditions for them to be built, and we've got issues with developers getting approvals and not building and that kind of thing. So they would argue against the usefulness of this metric, but overall, yeah, they're not the performance hasn't been there based on this metric, but they're not last. Burlington is last, but yeah, overall, we're not seeing a lot of construction in Mississauga right now.
So you're not surprised that they didn't go ahead with this multiplex? Not even a plan. It's really a plan to make a plan, I believe was what they were voting on.
Yeah, it's a plan to make a plan. And oddly enough, if I look at all the communities where this probably doesn't make as much of a difference to the housing stock, it might be Mississauga, right? Because most of the places you're going to get a lot of fourplexes aren't so much building new or renovating homes, but it's actually in new subdivisions, allowing developers to go, hey, well, if I put in a bunch of fourplexes all over the place, I can probably charge more for them and make more money. So it doesn't, Mississauga probably doesn't affect all that much. I guess what some of these counselors might be worried about is, again, folks like me, existing homeowners, going, well, hey, wait, if I tear down my home and replace it with a fourplex, maybe I can rent out the other three units and make some money. It's good for the housing supply, but it might annoy some of their neighbors. So I guess that's what they're thinking. I don't know. It's a bit challenging to me.
But it seems like it's something that should be put throughout a lot of different places in this province, because even places where like there's not a lot of new developments of like low rise, I keep thinking like of kids and of seniors who might not want the full family size home, like people who are, I think about all of my friends who are moving out of the city, and they generally want to live in a house. And I keep thinking if they could live in a unit in a low rise with a shared backyard with another family in a duplex or triplex or fourplex, I think a lot of them would choose that instead of moving far out. And then also I think about seniors who want to downsize and have nowhere to go. So if they have it as an option, at least a senior could potentially, like, they could renovate their home, or they can move into a home that's been renovated. they could live in a place where they have an apartment where they can just walk in and not have any stairs. Like, it could actually make a big difference for the people who are living there right now and still want to stay in their neighborhoods as they age, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we were looking at the data recently. Jesse Helmer, who works with me at the Institute, and something like a third of individuals who are single family individuals. So this could be somebody who's single or a widower or what have you. A third of them live in a single detached home with 3 bedrooms or more. So you think about that for, you've got these people, a single person living in a 3 or 4 or 5 bedroom home, having options where they could say, okay, you know what? I don't need all of this space. Maybe I can renovate it, split this home in two or three, stay here because I like the neighborhood, I like the stores, things like that, but then make a little bit of money renting out these side units, but still having some privacy. It's not like a completely shared home that might be able to help them out. So there's a big challenge we have in this province, better utilizing the housing stock that we have. And that's, one of the sort of disappointing things about this vote.
Yeah, being able to actually use what we have, that makes a lot of sense. And I know I remember once getting in trouble on Twitter when I brought it that that's exactly what you said, where I said how the number of people who are living in places with way too many bedrooms for the number of people living there. And we have too many people who are needing more bedrooms, who are living in places with too few. Like, how do we solve that problem? And there seem to be a lot of people who are like, oh, you're saying that these people who have these owe these people their homes, or what are you suggesting we do about that? Are you saying that we need to tax them for their bedrooms? And I'm like, no, it's just, this is a real problem we have. And like, it doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help those people who can't maybe upkeep an entire family size home, or they can't, or they don't want to have a whole house. Like, it makes a lot of sense for everyone if they solve this. I think it's really would be good all around. So, I mean,
Yeah, absolutely. And I get frustrated at that too. Sometimes this conversation where you talk about seniors being overhoused and you're like, what, you're just going to round them up and put them into long-term care homes or things like that. It's like, no, that's not what I'm suggesting. It's, and I like to use the term, it's a little academic and wonky, but I call it involuntarily overhoused. It's people who have too much housing, who would like to have less, but can't find somewhere to go. And I talk to folks like my parents and their friends all the time, and they're in their mid 70s and older, and a lot of times they would love to downsize, but they want to stay in their neighborhood. They like going to the dog park, they like seeing their friends and things like that. They don't want to move to a high-rise condo downtown, particularly they've spent the last 40 years in the suburbs, but there's nowhere for them to go. So absolutely, if we can create new housing options, which could be fourplexes, allow them to stay in the neighborhoods they want to be in, that would help them downsize and create more housing options for first-time home buyers. And it's also a better use for our infrastructure. I can't tell you how many existing elementary schools and high schools in older neighborhoods where they're having to bus kids in because like everybody who lives in that neighborhood built in the 80s, they're all seniors now and don't have kids there. And then other parts of cities where the class they have more portable classrooms than they have actual classrooms in the buildings, because it's just nothing but young kids, right? So if we could allow young families to, I know this is a bit of a rant, but if we could figure out to get ways to get young families into these subdivisions built in the 70s and 80s, we'd also just better utilize our infrastructure.
yeah, fewer people having to drive places, more people walking their kids to school, it'd all be a lot better if they could, if it'd be and safer for people if they can do that in an area where it's built for that kind of thing, right? Like, that makes a lot of sense. I was thinking about with Bonnie Crombie running to be Liberal leader, like watching the Liberal leadership race, it seems like they actually are getting a little bit of a fight to see who has the best housing plan, and like, that's amazing to see. Do you think that this could hurt her in the race?
Yeah, it might. I mean, it might already solidify perceptions that people already have of her. Though I've noticed as well, though, that she's also getting criticized for being too developer friendly, and it's kind of hard to square that circle of being too NIMBY and being too developer friendly at the same time. So I don't know how much it's going to hurt her, particularly when some of the criticism that she's getting is somewhat contradictory. I will say that her and the other three candidates as well have really upped their game on the housing file. That they don't have perfect plans, but there does seem to be this kind of race to the top thing happening, which is fantastic to see.
Yeah, hopefully it translates to the next election, all the parties doing that as well. The provincial housing minister, Paul Calandra, made it clear he wasn't happy about Mississauga's decision, and he said that the province wouldn't tolerate them preventing development. And I want to read a tweet out that I had read from Eric Lombardi, the head of More Neighbours Toronto, where he said, "Can someone explain to Paul Calandra what his job is? He is responsible for this. We literally would not be having this conversation right now if the Ontario PC Party had just listened to its provincial housing task force and legalized fourplexes by right." And I read that and thought, he's not wrong. The Housing Affordability Task Force recommended that exactly, and the government didn't do it. And if they had, we wouldn't have had to have these votes in different municipalities, but it looks like they're just kind of kicking it to the municipalities going, I don't know if this is going to be popular for us to do it, so you guys take the heat, but also you better do the thing that we actually could be making you guys do. Like, what's up with that?
Yeah, it's a good way of describing it because absolutely that the provincial affordability task force back in the report, which is February 2022, it's almost 2 full years old now, recommended that the province set that as a minimum standard, which it absolutely can. We have to remember that municipalities are creatures of the province. So if the province says fourplexes by right everywhere, fourplexes by right everywhere. They chose for whatever reason not to do that, which I think is unfortunate. They did make some changes on triplexes and a few other things, but they didn't go fully there. So that created a bit of a vacuum, which the federal government has decided to fill. Now, jurisdictionally, the federal government can't tell Mississauga or Guelph to do this because it's in provincial jurisdiction. But what they can do is basically say, oh, well, we've got this housing accelerator and we've got $4 billion here. But if you want it, you have to meet all of these conditions. So basically the province could dictate reforms. They didn't do that. So the federal government is basically buying those reforms. Now, one thing that the province is doing that is smart, and I think they should have done about 18 months ago, is they've actually asked all the municipalities to basically go over the Affordability Task Force report and say, which one of these recommendations do you like and which ones don't you like? And I think for the province, is essentially a win-win approach, where if the municipalities say, okay, yeah, we're fine if you do these things, then they can do it and the municipalities can't complain. If the municipalities say, well, we don't like these 17 recommendations or whatever, then it allows the province to basically say, see, we're trying, but it's not us that's the NIMBYs, it's these city councils. So
they could make the hard decision for them, and they can say, too bad. Like they if they wanted to do it, if the goal was more housing and not just politics, like they could just do it, right?
They could do it. Yeah, it's smart in a make this somebody else's problem type approach. It's definitely the opposite of what we teach in leadership courses at Ivy, but politically it's quite clever.
That's all for us today. Thanks so much for listening. And this episode was produced by Meredith Martin.
Please like and subscribe or leave a comment. It would help us out a lot.
See you next time.